Imagine trying to piece together this gigantic, wildly complex jigsaw puzzle.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right, but we are talking about a puzzle with like over 600,000 individual pieces.
Oh, man, that sounds like a nightmare.
It gets worse.
Hmm?
Imagine that those pieces were drawn by dozens of different artists.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, spread across 3 different continents and created over a span of more than 1,000 years.
So none of the pieces even match stylistically.
Exactly. And to top it all off, someone dumped all those pieces onto your living room floor, threw away the box, and just walked right out the door.
Okay, yeah, that's just cruel. You'd have zero idea what the final picture is even supposed to look like.
Right, you have no reference image. Trying to tackle something like that wouldn't just be hard, it would be a recipe for, like, total psychological exhaustion.
You might find a couple of pieces that fit together just based on their shape, I guess.
Yeah, maybe.
But you'd have absolutely no context for where they actually belong in the grand scheme of things.
And that feeling, that sheer, unadulterated overwhelm, is exactly what most people experience when they try to engage with the most debated, influential, and honestly misunderstood collection of texts in human history.
It really is.
Welcome, everyone. I am so incredibly thrilled you are joining us today. We are pulling from this massive stack of historical timelines, ancient linguistic research, and scholarly outlines to extract the ultimate framework for you.
It's a huge undertaking.
It totally is. Today, we are doing a deep dive into Bible Basics, the Absolute Beginner's Guide.
And it's such a deeply rewarding topic because, I mean, the cultural and literary fingerprints of this text are just everywhere.
Completely everywhere.
Yeah.
So, if you've ever felt overwhelmed by the text, this is your Bible Basics, the Absolute Beginner's Guide.
We are going to sort those puzzle pieces today.
Yes, we are.
Yeah.
And our entire mission today is to have a fun, completely jargon-free, non-preachy conversation.
Right, keeping it super accessible.
Exactly. Whether you are coming to this as a devout believer or, a curious skeptic or just someone who loves ancient history, we are keeping things rigorously objective. We're looking at the mechanics of the text.
Building that picture on the puzzle box.
Exactly. And to give you that picture, we're going to explore 5 crucial things today.
A roadmap is definitely helpful here.
For sure. First, we'll define what this collection actually is. Second, we're going to map out its historical origin story.
Which is fascinating, by the way.
Oh, it really is.
Right.
Third, we'll uncover the common ways modern readers drastically misuse it. Fourth, we'll identify the 4 ancient covenants. Those act as the binding agents for the whole narrative.
The corner pieces.
Yes, the corner pieces.
Yeah.
And finally, we will take a detailed, guided tour through the structure of both the Old and New Testaments.
That is a solid roadmap. And honestly, a really good place to start building that puzzle frame is just with the word itself.
The word Bible.
Yeah. Because Bible comes from the ancient Greek word biblia, which is super interesting because biblia is a plural noun.
Wait, really? Plural?
Yeah. It literally translates to books or scrolls.
Okay, that instantly shatters the most common misconception right there.
Right.
Because I think most people just picture a single heavy letterbound tome, written from start to finish by one person.
Exactly. But it's actually a library.
A sprawling library.
A massive, sprawling library. I mean, the printing press, the technology that actually allowed us to bind hundreds of pages together into a single object between 2 covers, that's a relatively recent human invention.
Good point.
For the vast majority of its existence, this collection was just a decentralized assortment of individual papyrus scrolls and animal skin parchments.
Okay, and approaching a library requires a completely different mindset than approaching, say, a novel.
100%. You wouldn't walk into your local public library, pull a book on ancient agricultural law off the shelf, and then read it with the exact same interpretive lens as a book of romantic poetry.
Right, and you definitely wouldn't expect them to flow as one continuous, linear narrative.
You would be profoundly confused if you tried that.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we are dealing with this scattered library of ancient scrolls, how did they all end up curated into one cohesive collection?
Well, let's ground this geographically and historically first. We need to travel back to the ancient Near East.
Okay, setting the scene.
Right, to a narrow strip of land bordering the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea. The timeline is roughly 1000 BCE.
And just to clarify for everyone, BCE stands for Before Common Era. Scholars use it to denote the era before the year 1.
Exactly.
Yep.
So at this time, we have the ancient Hebrews. They are a collection of loosely affiliated tribes, and honestly, they're often in conflict with each other and their neighbors.
Right, it wasn't exactly a unified front.
No, not at all. But the political landscape shifts dramatically with the emergence of a figure named David.
Ah, King David.
Yes. He originates as this rural, almost folk hero kind of figure from a southern tribe called Judah, but he possesses this incredible military and political acumen.
He's a strategist.
A brilliant one. He manages to unite these disparate warring tribes into a single, cohesive nation. And then he captures a strategically located hilltop town called Jerusalem.
And he makes that the centralized capital.
Exactly. He effectively transforms them from a scattered tribal identity into a unified monarchical state.
He does. And David becomes the ultimate cultural bedrock for the ancient Israelites, right?
Oh, absolutely. He's the legendary king, the gold standard against which literally every single future monarch will be measured.
Wow.
And after David passes away, his son Solomon takes the throne and initiates this massive public works project, the crown jewel of which is the construction of a permanent, magnificent temple in Jerusalem.
Okay, the concept of the temple is something I really want to pause and unpack here.
Yeah, we need to.
Because the modern associations we have with that word are just totally inadequate.
So true.
When someone today hears temple, they usually picture, a quiet building where people go for an hour on the weekend for quiet reflection.
Right, a very localized, personal thing.
But an ancient temple functioned more like a modern, multi-billion-dollar sports stadium combined with a Federal Reserve Bank.
That analogy captures the scale perfectly.
Right. In the ancient world, a temple drove the entire local economy. It was the absolute center of national pride.
But the crucial differentiator is the theological weight it carried.
Right, the divine element.
Exactly. The ancient Israelites, and honestly, their surrounding neighbors too, believed that a deity literally resided within the innermost chamber of their temple.
It was the physical intersection point between the divine realm and the human world.
Yes. So to have the grandest temple meant your city was chosen. It meant you were protected and inherently secure.
The psychological security that structure provided must have been incredible.
It cannot be overstated. The authors of these texts firmly believed that as long as the temple stood in Jerusalem, the presence of their God was with them, guaranteeing their safety.
And for roughly 400 years, the descendants of David ruled from this city, right?
They did. And during this 4-century span, a massive literary output occurred. The royal courts and the religious leaders were meticulously recording the histories of their kings.
They were compiling extensive legal codes, gathering collections of ancient wisdom.
Yeah, and writing down the provocative speeches of their prophets.
But then, we hit a historical brick wall.
A massive one.
The year is 589 BCE. The geopolitical plates shift, and the Babylonian Empire, which is an absolute superpower led by King Nebuchadnezzar, sweeps down into the region.
They lay siege to Jerusalem.
And it is a slow, agonizing, and ultimately catastrophic defeat for the Israelites. The Babylonians breach the city walls, they capture the reigning king from David's line, and then they do the unthinkable.
They completely leveled the temple.
Burn it to its foundations.
This event right here is the traumatic epicenter of the entire Old Testament.
I can't even imagine the shock.
To understand the profound shock of this, we have to look at the sociology of the era. They didn't just lose a war, their entire worldview collapsed.
Because they had believed their God was invincible.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that their temple was impenetrable. Now that sacred house is just a smoldering ruin, destroyed by a foreign army that attributes its victory to completely different gods.
Wow.
The royal family is deposed, and the Babylonians implement this brutal policy of mass deportation.
The exile.
Right. They forcefully exile the educated elite, the artisans, and the leaders hundreds of miles away to Babylon.
The existential crisis must have been agonizing. I mean, they are sitting as captives in a foreign empire, grappling with the ultimate question. Did our God lose?
Was the promise made to King David a lie? Were we wrong about our entire identity?
And their collective response to that crushing psychological trauma is actually the very mechanism that birthed the first major portion of the library we're discussing today.
Exactly. To survive the cognitive dissonance, the exiled scholars and priests began frantically organizing, editing, and curating their vast collection of scrolls.
They compiled the histories, the laws, the prophetic warnings, basically to explain their own tragedy.
They were looking for an explanation for the chaos.
Right.
Precisely. And the narrative they constructed argued fiercely that no, their god had not been defeated by the Babylonian gods.
Okay, so how do they explain it then?
The narrative presented the exile as a deliberate divine punishment. The texts claimed that the Israelites and their kings had spent centuries violating their own sacred laws, exploiting the poor, and worshiping foreign idols.
Oh, I see. So the destruction of Jerusalem wasn't a failure of their God's power.
Right. It was the inevitable, promised consequence of their own rebellion. Organizing the texts gave them a framework to make sense of their suffering.
It turns a story of meaningless defeat into a story of justice and consequence. That makes so much sense.
It does. And eventually, the political tides turn again.
The Persians, right.
Yeah, the Babylonians are conquered by the Persian Empire, and the Persian king, Cyrus the Great, implements a radically different foreign policy.
He actually permits the exiled people to return to their homeland.
Right. And by the way, this is when they are beginning to be referred to as Jews, derived from the kingdom of Judah.
Got it.
So they travel back to the ruins of Jerusalem, and they rebuild a modest version of their temple.
But the atmosphere is completely different now.
Completely different. They are back in their geographic homeland, sure, but they are still a subjugated people. They're paying heavy taxes to a foreign empire.
The glorious, independent era of King David is just a memory preserved in their newly curated library of scrolls.
Which is the collection we now call the Old Testament. And so a deep, pervasive culture of anticipation sets in. They begin waiting for a future intervention.
Which perfectly bridges us into the origins of the second half of the library.
Let's fast forward.
Right. We skip through several centuries of shifting empires, from the Persians to the Greeks under Alexander the Great, and finally to the suffocating grip of the Roman Empire.
It's the 1st century CE, the Common Era.
And the political climate in Judea is intensely volatile. The Romans demand heavy taxation and brutally suppress any hint of rebellion,
often utilizing the horrific method of public crucifixion to terrify the populace into submission.
Into this powder keg steps a man from a marginalized rural village called Nazareth.
Jesus.
Right. He begins traveling the countryside as an itinerant teacher, and his message is incredibly provocative.
He frequently clashes with the established religious authorities, critiquing their hypocrisy and rigidity.
He gathers a devoted following, and whispers begin to circulate. People start thinking he might actually be the long-awaited leader who will finally overthrow the Roman oppressors.
And restore the nation's independence.
But the Roman authorities and the threatened local leaders, they view him as a dangerous political agitator.
So around the year 30 CE, he is arrested, subjected to a mock trial, and publicly executed via crucifixion in Jerusalem.
From a purely secular, historical perspective, that should have been the final footnote of his life.
It was a very common end for would-be revolutionaries in the 1st century. Rome crushed dissidents daily, and those movements invariably dissolved upon the death of their leader.
But the movement surrounding Jesus experienced an unprecedented anomaly.
A massive anomaly. Shortly after his execution, his devastated followers began making a stunning, wildly subversive claim.
They asserted that he had physically resurrected from the dead.
That single audacious claim is the spark that ignites a global phenomenon.
The movement refuses to die. Instead, it explodes outward from Jerusalem. It travels along the Roman trade routes, crossing cultural and geographical boundaries,
moving into Greece, Asia Minor, and eventually penetrating the very heart of the empire, the city of Rome itself.
And as this grassroots movement rapidly scales across the Mediterranean, the original leaders, the apostles, find themselves facing massive logistical and cultural challenges.
Right, because they're suddenly overseeing a vast network of incredibly diverse, localized communities.
The early churches.
Yeah, and these communities are completely disconnected from each other.
So to manage this, the apostles start writing letters. And I think the best way for a modern reader to understand these letters is to view them through the lens of a rapidly expanding global startup.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Imagine a tech company founded in a small garage in Silicon Valley that suddenly opens branch offices in Tokyo, London, and Dubai, all within a few years.
Chaos.
Total chaos. The home office is suddenly inundated with frantic questions. How do we adapt our company culture to local laws? What do we do when the local managers disagree?
Right.
The founders have to urgently fire off memos to extinguish these cultural fires and keep everyone aligned with the original vision.
That is exactly how the epistles functioned.
The epistles being the letters.
Yes.
Yeah.
The apostles were writing urgent, highly specific letters to cities like Corinth or Ephesus, addressing very real crises.
like mediating disputes about dietary laws.
Or explaining how to blend ancient Jewish traditions with complex Greek philosophies, and honestly, offering guidance on how to survive when local Roman magistrates began arresting them for refusing to worship the emperor.
Wow, so really practical, high-stakes stuff.
Very much so. And over several generations, these crucial letters of guidance, along with 4 written historical accounts of Jesus' life, were meticulously copied, circulated, and eventually compiled.
Into what we now call the New Testament.
Exactly.
Okay, but this brings up a profound tension that often trips people up.
What's that?
Well, the text we have today frequently contains claims of divine inspiration. You read the prophets, and they constantly use the phrase, "Thus says the Lord."
Right.
And there is a famous line in one of the New Testament letters that asserts all Scripture is God-breathed.
Yes, there is.
But when we look at the actual historical process of canonization, the process of deciding exactly which scrolls and letters made it into the final library and which were rejected, it was a centuries-long, deeply human endeavor.
Oh, filled with intense debate, theological arguments, and historical
It
verification.
was incredibly rigorous, wasn't it?
It was. The early church councils didn't just rubber stamp a magical list that floated down from the sky. They spent centuries arguing over the authenticity, the apostolic origins, and the theological consistency of every single document.
But let me push back on that, because this is where a lot of modern readers throw their hands up.
Okay, lay it on me.
If the foundational premise of the Christian faith relies on the authority of these texts, and the texts themselves are making the claim that they are true, doesn't that create a massive loop of circular reasoning?
It sounds like it.
Isn't it incredibly fragile to essentially say, the Bible is true solely because the Bible says it's true?
That is a very valid critique, and it is a logical trap that some modern adherents unfortunately fall into.
Right.
But if we analyze the mindset of the earliest followers in the first century, they did not operate with a completed book in their hands. The formal compilation of the New Testament didn't happen until hundreds of years later.
So what do they base it on?
Their entire worldview was built on a very different foundation. They utilized a rigorous, if-then logical progression that anchored their belief not in a piece of parchment, but in what they firmly believed was a concrete historical event.
Okay, break down that if-then progression for me. How do they logically validate the texts without using the texts themselves as the starting point?
Well, the foundational if for the early Christians was the resurrection.
Got it.
Their logic flowed like this. If it is historically true that Jesus of Nazareth was executed and physically rose from the dead, then his unprecedented claims to possess divine authority are fundamentally validated.
Okay, the resurrection was the proof of concept.
Exactly.
Okay.
Building on that, if his claims of authority are validated by his resurrection, then his specific teachings and his worldview hold ultimate value.
I'm following.
And if his teachings hold ultimate value, then the men he personally selected, trained, and authorized as his apostles, the founders of the movement, are credible representatives of his message.
Right, the chain of command.
Yep. If those specific apostles authored letters to guide the early communities, then those letters possess an inherent derived authority.
Which covers the New Testament. What of the Old?
Well, finally, if Jesus himself continually referenced, validated, and taught from the ancient Jewish scrolls, then those older texts are also deeply authoritative.
Wow, that reframes the entire paradigm. The authority doesn't magically emanate from the ink and papyrus. It flows backward from their conviction about a historical event.
Exactly. The human debate over canonization was simply their meticulous effort to ensure they were only including documents that accurately reflected the teachings of the person they believed conquered death.
It anchors the library in a historical movement, rather than treating it like a mystical artifact that materialized out of thin air.
Exactly. Understanding that history is incredibly clarifying.
It really is. But knowing where a tool came from is only half the battle. You also have to know how the tool is supposed to be utilized.
Very true.
Which leads us perfectly to our next major question. What is this massive ancient library actually FOR? And perhaps more importantly, what are the most disastrous ways people misuse it today?
Establishing the proper use case is vital. When you use a complex tool for a task it was never engineered to perform, the results are usually catastrophic.
Oh, I have a favorite analogy that perfectly illustrates this dynamic.
Let's hear it.
Let's say you purchase an authentic, brilliantly written, culturally rich Cajun cookbook. It contains the absolute finest, most rigorously tested recipes for gumbo, etouffee, and jambalaya known to humanity.
Making me hungry.
Right. Now imagine you fly into New Orleans for a vacation. You rent a car at the airport, and instead of using a GPS, you place that Cajun cookbook on the dashboard, flip open to the recipe for blackened catfish, and attempt to use it as a street map to navigate your way to the French Quarter.
The outcome is guaranteed. You are going to end up profoundly lost, probably stranded in a swamp.
Precisely. And when you inevitably find yourself lost and frustrated, the logical response isn't to throw the cookbook out the window and scream, "This book is broken, the author is a liar, this entire text is false."
Because the book isn't broken in the slightest, the recipes are still perfect.
The failure lies entirely with the user. You are demanding that the text perform a function it was never designed to perform.
And the Bible suffers from this exact same phenomenon.
Right. It doesn't contain a divine bulleted preface on page 1 explicitly detailing exactly how a 21st century reader is supposed to interact with its contents.
It couldn't possibly have a unified preface.
Yeah.
Because, as we established, the individual authors writing these scrolls centuries apart had no concept that their work would eventually be bound together into a single volume.
Right. They were just writing for their immediate audience.
To understand the purpose of the texts, you have to look at the explicitly stated intentions of the individual authors.
Give me an example.
For instance, the ancient author of the Book of Proverbs opens his scroll by explicitly declaring his thesis. He is writing a collection of maxims to impart wisdom, discipline, and prudence to young people.
Okay. Very straightforward.
On the other hand, the author of the Gospel of Luke opens his account with a formal historical prologue. He explicitly states that he has meticulously investigated eyewitness testimony in order to write an orderly, sequential historical narrative for a specific individual named Theophilus.
The purposes are as diverse as the genres. But because modern culture often flattens the library into a single monolithic rulebook, we see readers constantly falling into 3 major categories of misuse.
Let's explore these.
Yeah, starting with misuse number 1. Applying the text's ancient principles without adjusting for massive cultural and socioeconomic shifts.
This is an incredibly prevalent error. Modern readers frequently forget that these documents were authored for societies existing thousands of years ago in the ancient Near East.
Their political structures, their agrarian economies, and their daily survival realities were vastly different from our modern, industrialized world.
A perfect example of this friction occurs when dealing with ancient financial warnings.
Oh, this is a good one.
The text contains a very stark proverb stating that the borrower is slave to the lender. Now, a modern reader living in an industrialized nation might read that verse, look down at their credit card statement or their 30-year mortgage, and experience a wave of profound guilt.
They might interpret the text to mean that utilizing any form of modern credit is a deep spiritual failing.
But that interpretation completely ignores the brutal historical reality of ancient economics.
Because in the ancient world, there was no bankruptcy protection.
Exactly. There were no credit bureaus to temporarily lower your score. If an ancient farmer experienced a severe drought and couldn't pay back a loan to a wealthy landowner, the consequences were physical and horrifying.
How bad did it get?
The debt was frequently settled by literally selling yourself, your spouse, and your children into physical human slavery to work off the debt.
Oh, wow. That is heavy.
The text is providing a dire, urgent warning against the literal loss of human bodily autonomy. It is not offering a nuanced critique of modern, regulated, fiat currency banking systems.
So attempting to directly map an ancient warning about literal slavery onto the concept of a modern student loan creates a tremendous amount of unnecessary anxiety and theological confusion.
It's demanding the cookbook act as a modern financial planner.
Exactly. Which brings us to misuse number 2, treating the library like a magic 8-ball.
Oh, I like to call this the personalized daily horoscope approach to ancient literature.
Exactly. It's a remarkably common phenomenon. An individual is facing a complex modern dilemma. Maybe they're trying to decide if they should accept a job offer in a new city or if they should end a struggling romantic relationship.
Right.
In a desperate search for a one-to-one personalized message from the divine, they will literally close their eyes, let the book fall open to a random page, point their finger blindly at a verse, and expect that specific sentence to provide direct, actionable advice for their 21st century problem.
The statistical probability of that working out well is virtually 0.
So true.
If you employ that method, and your finger happens to land in the middle of the book of Leviticus, you might find yourself reading a highly technical 3,000-year-old architectural specification regarding exactly how many loops of blue yarn are required to construct the curtain of a portable goat hair tent used for ritual animal sacrifice.
If you try to extract modern career advice from that sentence, you're going to be deeply disappointed.
The library was meticulously crafted to reveal the overarching character of the divine and the broad trajectory of human history. It was never intended to function as an individualized, on-demand codex for solving your daily personal dramas.
And that leads directly to the most expansive error, misuse number 3, the skeleton key to the universe.
Ah, the skeleton key.
This happens when readers assume that because the text is inspired by a deity who is omniscient, the text itself must inherently contain all possible knowledge about everything.
They attempt to weaponize ancient poetry to answer highly technical modern questions.
Like about the exact age of the Earth's geological strata, or the intricacies of quantum mechanics.
Or the viability of certain macroeconomic theories. Or they try to decipher ancient symbolism to calculate the exact calendar date of the end of the world.
Right. It is a fundamental category error. The text is remarkably sophisticated, but it never once makes the claim that it is a comprehensive encyclopedia of all human and scientific knowledge.
So if we strip away the misuses, if it's not a modern street map, it's not a personalized Magic 8 Ball, and it's certainly not a geology textbook, what is the actual intended function of this massive collection of words?
Good question.
When you synthesize the diverse genres and the historical arcs, the overarching purpose becomes clear. The library was compiled, preserved, and canonized to help humanity understand its fundamental relationship with the divine.
Okay.
For the Jewish community, it is the story of their covenantal relationship with God. For Christians, the entire collection serves as the necessary prelude and the detailed theological framework for understanding the identity, the teachings, and the world-altering significance of Jesus.
It is a deeply relational, theological, and culturally unifying document designed to forge a resilient community identity.
It is emphatically not a modern life hack manual.
I think that clarity is incredibly liberating. By the way, as we are unpacking the deep mechanics of this ancient library, if you know someone, a friend, a coworker, a family member, who is insanely curious about history, literature, or religion, but usually finds this specific topic overwhelming, share this deep dive with them right now.
Yes, please do.
And be sure to hit subscribe so you never miss out as we continue to untangle the world's most complex subjects. We absolutely love exploring these massive topics with you.
You really do.
All right, let's keep building this puzzle. We've defined what the library is and what it isn't, but we still have dozens of separate books written across a millennium. What actually binds these 600,000 words together into a single, cohesive narrative?
To discover the binding agent, we have to look closely at the legal and relational mechanisms of the ancient world. Specifically, we have to understand the concept of a covenant.
A covenant. Today, we might use that word to describe a restrictive clause in a neighborhood homeowners association contract,
Like painting your fence the wrong color?
Right, but in the ancient world, it carried profoundly more weight.
Immensely more weight. In the ancient Near East, a covenant was the ultimate legally binding treaty. It was most often utilized to forge an unbreakable relationship between a powerful lord or king and a subjugated people.
So these were not casual handshake agreements.
Not at all. They were matters of life and death, and they were frequently ratified through visceral, intense rituals.
The ceremonies were incredibly graphic, weren't they?
They were deliberately graphic to illustrate the severity of the contract. A common method of ratifying a covenant involved taking several large animals, literally slicing them in half, and arranging the bloody halves in 2 rows.
Wait, literally in half?
Literally. And then the lesser party, the subject entering into the agreement, would have to physically walk down the aisle between the severed animal halves.
That is terrifying.
It was a stark, horrifying piece of performance art that communicated a crystal clear message. If I ever violate the terms of this treaty, may my fate be exactly the same as these animals.
That is a terrifyingly effective way to ensure compliance. You don't forget an agreement like that.
You really don't.
And the entire narrative arc of this vast library is suspended upon 4 specific monumental covenants that the text claims God initiated with humanity.
These 4 covenants are the crucial corner pieces of our massive jigsaw puzzle.
Once you lock these 4 corners into place, the overwhelming chaos of the remaining pieces begins to organize itself into a clear picture.
Precisely. So the first corner piece is arguably the foundational bedrock for the rest of the text. It is known as the Abrahamic covenant. We find this in the very first book of the library, Genesis.
And the narrative presents God singling out a seemingly random individual named Abraham.
And Abraham's demographic profile makes him an incredibly unlikely candidate to launch a global movement.
Why is that?
Well, he is a foreigner residing in the ancient region of Mesopotamia, which corresponds roughly to modern-day Iraq. More importantly, he and his wife are elderly, and they have never been able to have children.
Yet the text claims God initiates a covenant with this elderly, childless nomad and makes three staggering, unconditional promises.
Right. First, God promises to give Abraham's descendants a very specific piece of prime real estate, the land of Canaan.
Second, God promises that despite his advanced age and his wife's infertility, Abraham will become the patriarch of a massive nation, with descendants as numerous as the stars.
But it is the third promise that acts as the primary engine for the entire library.
The big one.
God promises that through Abraham's specific family line, all the nations of the earth will eventually receive a profound blessing.
That third clause is the game changer. It establishes the central thesis of the Old Testament. This specific family, the future nation of Israel, is not just being blessed for their own comfort.
They are being chosen to act as the specific vehicle through which the divine intends to interact with and ultimately rescue the entire world.
Everything that follows in the text is meticulously tracking the survival and the destiny of that specific family line.
Which brings us to corner piece number 2, the Law of Moses. This is the covenant that permeates the majority of the Old Testament texts.
So we fast forward a few centuries in the narrative here.
Yeah. Abraham's descendants have indeed multiplied into a vast population, fulfilling the second promise. However, they are currently suffering as enslaved laborers under the brutal regime of the Egyptian Empire.
The text details how God recruits a man named Moses to orchestrate their liberation.
And the narrative of that liberation, the famous story of the Exodus, is framed as a massive cosmic confrontation.
The 10 plagues, right?
Yes, the 10 plagues that devastate Egypt aren't described as random ecological disasters. The text specifically portrays them as targeted, systematic strikes designed to dismantle and humiliate the Egyptian pantheon of gods.
The God of the Israelites violently defeats the enslavers, leads the people out into the desolate wilderness, and brings them to the base of Mount Sinai.
And it is here that a radically new type of covenant is established. This is where we see the introduction of the Ten Commandments, along with hundreds of other detailed societal laws.
Now, it is crucial to understand how this covenant fundamentally differs from the covenant made with Abraham.
Because Abraham's covenant was an unconditional promise. God simply said, I will do this.
But the covenant with Moses introduces a completely different dynamic. It is highly conditional.
It introduces the mechanism of terms and conditions.
Exactly. It introduces the stark reality of conditional blessings and curses.
God's proposition to the newly freed Israelites is essentially this: I have demonstrated my power by rescuing you from slavery. Now, if you choose to obey these strict laws, if you maintain absolute loyalty to me, if you meticulously care for the widows, the orphans, and the immigrants among you, and if you execute justice fairly, then you will experience unprecedented prosperity and security in the land I promised to your ancestor Abraham.
However, if you choose to rebel, if you adopt the violent practices of the surrounding nations, if you worship their idols, and if you exploit the vulnerable in your society, then you will suffer severe curses, and the ultimate consequence will be your violent expulsion and exile from the Promised Land.
When you grasp that single conditional mechanism, obey and prosper or rebel and face exile, you instantly unlock the narrative tension of every single book that follows in the Old Testament.
It's the lens for everything.
Every historical failure, every famine, and every time a ragged prophet stands outside a king's palace screaming about impending doom, they are simply pointing back to the terms of the Moses contract.
They are acting as covenant lawyers, screaming, "You are in breach of contract, and the penalty clause is about to be activated."
That tension drives the plot forward to corner piece number 3, the Davidic covenant.
Back to King David.
Right. After years of wandering, the Israelites eventually conquer and settle the Promised Land. Over time, they transition from a loose confederation of tribes governed by judges to a centralized monarchy.
And as we discussed earlier, King David ascends to the throne.
He is wildly successful, securing the borders and establishing Jerusalem. And the text records that God initiates a highly specific, monumental covenant directly with David.
What's the promise this time?
God promises that a royal descendant from David's specific bloodline will sit on a throne, ruling over a kingdom of perfect peace and justice forever.
Forever. That's a big promise.
The divine authority and the Davidic throne become inextricably linked.
But this promise creates a massive, agonizing theological problem for the later generations.
Right, because of what happened next.
Exactly. Because, as we already covered, we know the historical reality. In 589 BCE, the Babylonians obliterate Jerusalem. The temple is reduced to ash.
The reigning kings from David's invincible bloodline are physically blinded, chained, and dragged off into captivity.
The throne is left completely empty, and it stays empty for centuries. So how did the ancient authors, who fiercely believed in the infallibility of their texts, reconcile a promise of a forever king with the stark reality of an empty, ruined throne?
The cognitive dissonance must have been deafening.
Truly.
It was the ultimate crisis of faith, and the psychological and theological mechanism they developed to cope with that broken reality was the concept of messianic anticipation.
They couldn't change their current political reality of subjugation, so they projected the promise into the future.
They began to scour their ancient texts, formulating a fervent belief that eventually, at some unknown point in the future, God would send an ultimate anointed leader, a Messiah, from the lineage of David.
This future king would forcefully expel the foreign empires, rebuild the nation's glory, and finally establish that promised kingdom of eternal justice.
The entire Old Testament, as a literary collection, intentionally concludes on this deeply unresolved note.
It is a story paused mid-sentence.
The people are waiting, watching the horizon for a king who hasn't arrived.
Which brings us perfectly to the final corner piece, number 4, the New Covenant.
We flip the page into the New Testament, and the narrative instantly centers on Jesus of Nazareth.
The entire rhetorical goal of the New Testament authors is to aggressively present Jesus as the ultimate combination of those 3 previous ancient corner pieces.
They argue that he is the long-awaited king from the line of David. However, the way he operates completely subverts the militaristic expectations of the people.
Right. The people were waiting for a military warlord to ride into Jerusalem on a war horse and physically slaughter the Roman legions.
But Jesus rides into the city on a borrowed donkey. He doesn't advocate for violent insurrection.
He fundamentally redefines the nature of the promised kingdom. Instead of offering political liberation from the Roman Empire, he offers a much deeper spiritual liberation from the internal human condition of selfishness, violence, and separation from the divine.
Through his execution and claimed resurrection, the text asserts that he inaugurates a new covenant.
And the brilliance of this new covenant is how it circles all the way back to fulfill that original ancient promise made to Abraham.
Remember the third clause.
That through Abraham's family, all nations would be blessed.
Exactly. The radical exclusivity of the Old Testament, where the relationship was strictly limited to a single ethnic group maintaining hundreds of rigorous dietary and purity laws, is suddenly shattered.
The new covenant acts as an open invitation. Jesus throws open the doors of this new spiritual kingdom to everyone, regardless of their ethnic background, their gender, or their social status.
The 4 corner pieces are locked in. Abraham's unconditional promise of global blessing, Moses' conditional rules that exposed humanity's inability to maintain the standard, David's anticipated eternal kingdom, and Jesus' unexpected, inclusive culmination.
Now that we have the frame firmly constructed, we can finally sort the hundreds of thousands of edge pieces. Let's take a high-level, guided tour through the structure of the library, starting with the Old Testament.
The Christian arrangement of the Old Testament contains 39 distinct books, and they are organized roughly by literary genre rather than strict chronological order.
The first major section is the Torah.
The Torah, frequently translated as the Law, consists of the first 5 scrolls of the library: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. If you want to understand anything in the rest of the Bible, you must understand the Torah because it establishes the foundational worldview.
Let's quickly trace the narrative arc of these 5 books. Genesis acts as the cosmic origin story, detailing the creation of humanity, the entry of evil into the world, and then zooming in tightly to track the dysfunctional, multi-generational saga of Abraham's specific family.
Exodus is the explosive action thriller. The family has grown into a nation, they are enslaved in Egypt, and Moses leads a terrifying, miraculous prison break.
Then we hit Leviticus, which is where many modern readers abandon their reading plans entirely.
Oh, Leviticus is notoriously difficult for modern audiences because it is essentially a highly detailed, ancient legal and architectural manual.
So many rules about tents.
Yes, it outlines the rigorous purity laws and the complex sacrificial systems required for the Israelites to safely live in close proximity to the divine presence, which they believed resided in their portable temple, the tabernacle.
Following that is Numbers, which chronicles a deeply tragic, decades-long road trip. The Israelites wander through the harsh desert wilderness, constantly complaining, rebelling against Moses, and demonstrating a profound lack of trust in the God who just rescued them.
Finally, we reach Deuteronomy. Moses is at the end of his life. The people are standing on the edge of the promised land. Moses delivers a massive, soaring farewell speech, pleading with this new generation to choose loyalty to the covenant so they can thrive in their new home.
That foundational block of the Torah sets the rules of engagement for everything that follows. The next major section is the history section, comprising 12 books.
This section operates as a sprawling, centuries-long historical chronicle.
It picks up immediately after the death of Moses. We have the Book of Joshua, detailing the violent, complex military campaign to conquer the land of Canaan.
Then the narrative descends into the Book of Judges. This is arguably the darkest, most chaotic text in the entire library.
Really? How so?
It describes a nightmare era where the nation has no centralized leadership, no king, and a terrifying refrain repeats throughout the book. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes.
Oh, wow.
It is a brutal exploration of societal collapse and moral anarchy.
The chaos of the judges eventually drives the people to demand a human king to restore order, which launches us into the books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles.
This is a sweeping, multi-generational political drama. We witness the anointing of King David, the establishment of Jerusalem, and the breathtaking wealth and architectural achievements of his son Solomon.
But the Golden Age is tragically short-lived. The narrative details a devastating civil war that permanently fractures the nation into two rival kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south.
The subsequent centuries are a grim cycle of political assassinations, rampant corruption, and kings who repeatedly violate the covenant of Moses by importing foreign idols and exploiting their own citizens.
This agonizing downward spiral culminates in the horrific climax we discussed earlier. The northern kingdom is obliterated by the Assyrian Empire, and the southern kingdom is conquered and dragged into exile by the Babylonians.
Interspersed alongside this grand historical narrative, we find the poetry and wisdom section containing 6 unique books.
This section shifts away from political history and dives deeply into the internal, emotional, and philosophical experience of the ancient Israelites.
It includes the Book of Psalms, which functioned essentially as the official hymn book for the temple in Jerusalem. It contains 150 songs, poems, and prayers that cover the absolute totality of human emotion.
From ecstatic, soaring praise to the darkest depths of suicidal despair and furious anger at God.
It's an incredibly raw emotional record. We also find the Book of Proverbs here, which acts as the foundational textbook for ancient wisdom.
Proverbs operates on a fairly straightforward premise. It presents the universe as an orderly system created by God. If you act with diligence, honesty, and wisdom, the system will generally reward you with prosperity and peace.
And if you act foolishly and wickedly, the system will crush you.
But the true brilliance of the ancient curators is revealed by the fact that they placed the Book of Job right next to Proverbs.
Yes. The philosophical tension between those two books is astounding.
If Proverbs says, "Do good and good things will inevitably happen to you," the Book of Job violently shatters that simplistic equation.
The narrative of Job focuses on a man who is explicitly described as blameless, incredibly righteous, and deeply devoted to God. Yet, in a terrifying sequence of events, Job is systematically stripped of absolutely everything.
His massive wealth is wiped out. His 10 children are killed in a freak disaster, and his physical body is ravaged by a painful disease.
Job forces the reader to confront the agonizing reality that the universe is not a simple vending machine where good behavior automatically dispenses rewards.
It explores the sheer, terrifying complexity of a world where horrific suffering frequently falls upon the innocent.
The book doesn't offer a neat, tied-with-a-bow answer to the problem of pain, but it validates the human right to grieve, to scream at the heavens, and to demand an audience with the divine.
It proves that this library is not afraid to argue with itself. The final section of the Old Testament is the prophecy section.
This consists of 16 books, traditionally divided into the major prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, named for their massive length, and the 12 minor prophets.
And we really need to correct a massive modern misunderstanding about the role of these figures. When a modern reader hears the word prophet, they immediately picture a mystical fortune teller staring into a crystal ball, trying to predict the geopolitical events of the 21st century.
That is a complete mischaracterization. Ancient Hebrew prophets were not fortune tellers. They were fierce, uncompromising social and spiritual critics.
Like whistleblowers.
The best modern equivalent would be a radical whistleblower or an investigative journalist. They operated outside the established power structures. They would stand in the public squares, outside the extravagant palaces and the bustling temples, and aggressively denounce the corrupt kings and the complacent priests.
Their entire message was anchored in the past, not the future. They were simply pointing back to the conditional covenant of Moses and screaming, "Look at how you're treating the poor. Look at the corruption in the courts. You have broken the ancient contract, and the inevitable consequences are racing toward us."
And to guarantee their warnings were heard, these prophets frequently utilized extreme, shocking performance art.
They went to astonishing lengths to visually illustrate their message.
The story of the prophet Hosea is the ultimate example of this.
Whoa, this one is wild.
The text claims that God deliberately commands Hosea to go and marry a woman who is known to be chronically unfaithful, a prostitute.
Hosea obeys. He marries her, they have children, but eventually she abandons the family. She betrays him, falls into severe destitution, and ends up being sold as a slave.
And then God tells Hosea to do the unthinkable, go find her, pay her massive debts to buy her freedom, and bring her back into his home as his beloved wife.
It is a deeply scandalous, humiliating narrative.
But the text explicitly explains the rationale behind the performance. God was forcing the prophet to physically embody the divine experience. God wanted to use Hosea's shattered heart, his public humiliation, and his shocking, radical forgiveness as a living, breathing metaphor for God's own agonizing relationship with the nation of Israel.
The authors believe this narrative vividly demonstrated that despite Israel's relentless spiritual adultery and rebellion, God possessed a fierce, determined, and ultimately restorative love for them.
The prophets warned of terrifying destruction, but they almost always concluded their books with breathtaking, poetic visions of future restoration. They promised that the devastation of the exile would not be the final word.
But, as we noted, the Old Testament concludes on a massive cliffhanger. The Jewish people are back in Jerusalem, the temple is rebuilt, but they are a minor, oppressed province in a vast empire. The promised Messiah has not arrived.
The screen cuts to black, and 400 years of silence pass.
Which launches us into Section 5, a high-level tour of the New Testament.
The page turns to the 1st century CE, and the library shifts focus entirely to the life and aftermath of Jesus. The New Testament opens with the Gospels, 4 separate books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that all chronicle the exact same events.
This is a structural quirk that deeply confuses people. I mean, if you were trying to convince the world that your religious leader is the ultimate truth, why would you include 4 slightly different, occasionally contradictory versions of his biography?
It seems counterintuitive.
Wouldn't one heavily edited, definitive, authorized biography be a much stronger rhetorical strategy?
From a modern corporate PR perspective, yes. But we have to remember the context we discussed earlier. The early Christian movement was rapidly expanding across wildly different cultural landscapes.
A theological argument that deeply resonated with a devout Jewish scholar in Jerusalem would completely fall flat when presented to a pragmatic Roman soldier in Italy or a philosophical Greek merchant in Athens.
The library wasn't written for a monolithic audience. The authors crafted their accounts to persuade highly specific demographics.
Let's break down those demographics. The first 3 books, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are categorized by scholars as the Synoptic Gospels because they share a massive amount of identical source material and follow a very similar narrative sequence.
But their subtle differences reveal their target audiences. Matthew was written by a Jewish author primarily for a Jewish audience. His entire rhetorical strategy is to meticulously connect the dots between the ancient texts and Jesus.
He constantly interrupts his own narrative to say, this happened specifically to fulfill this ancient prophecy. He is aggressively arguing that Jesus is the legitimate heir to the Davidic throne.
Mark, however, takes a completely different approach. Mark's gospel is the shortest, the punchiest, and moves at a breakneck speed. It reads like an action script.
The word immediately is used dozens of times.
Scholars believe Mark was writing for a Roman audience. A Roman reader didn't care about ancient Hebrew genealogies or obscure prophecies. They respected power, decisive action, and authority over the physical world. Mark deliberately emphasizes the sheer power of Jesus, his ability to command storms, cast out demons, and confront the authorities as a powerful, suffering servant.
Then we have Luke. Luke was written by an educated physician, and his target audience appears to be the broader Greek-speaking world. The Greeks valued comprehensive historical accounts, so Luke opens by assuring the reader he has thoroughly investigated the facts.
Furthermore, Luke's narrative radically emphasizes the social subversion of Jesus' message. Luke specifically highlights Jesus' interactions with the absolute lowest rungs of ancient society: the extreme poor, the diseased, the social outcasts, and women who possess virtually no legal standing in the ancient world.
Luke argues that this new kingdom fundamentally inverts the brutal social hierarchies of the Roman Empire.
And finally, we have the Gospel of John, which is the massive outlier. Roughly 90% of the material in John is completely unique. It doesn't appear in the other three accounts.
Why is it so different?
John isn't interested in providing a chronological biography. His gospel is a soaring, deeply philosophical, and highly theological reflection on the cosmic identity of Jesus. He doesn't begin his story with a baby in a manger in Bethlehem. He begins before the dawn of time, describing Jesus as the eternal divine word that created the universe.
John focuses heavily on the massive metaphorical declarations Jesus makes about himself, such as, "I am the light of the world," or "I am the bread of life."
Following the four Gospels, we transition to a single book of history, the Acts of the Apostles.
Acts is essentially part two of Luke's Gospel, written by the same author. It is the action-packed sequel that chronicles the explosive first 3 decades of the early church.
The narrative starts in a claustrophobic upper room in Jerusalem, where a small group of terrified followers are hiding after the crucifixion. But following their experience of the resurrected Jesus and the dramatic arrival of the Holy Spirit, the movement catches fire.
Acts tracks the frantic, dangerous expansion of the message as it violently clashes with local customs, sparks riots in ancient cities, and steadily marches across the map until the book concludes with the lead apostle, Paul, sitting under house arrest in the imperial capital of Rome, boldly preaching right under the nose of the emperor.
It is a remarkable documentation of a grassroots movement scaling globally, and that explosive expansion is what necessitated the next massive section of the New Testament, the epistles.
These are 22 specific letters written by the early leaders. As we noted earlier, these functioned as the critical startup memos, attempting to hold the fragile communities together.
The sheer sociological miracle of what these letters were trying to accomplish is staggering. The majority of these letters were authored by Paul.
Paul was originally a highly educated, fiercely strict Jewish Pharisee who actively hunted and imprisoned early Christians before experiencing a radical conversion and becoming the movement's most prolific missionary. He spent his life traveling the dangerous Roman road networks, establishing small house churches in major urban centers.
And the demographics inside those house churches were unprecedented in the ancient world. You had devout, rule-following Jewish believers sitting in the same small room, sharing a meal with former pagans Gentiles, which simply means non-Jewish people, who had spent their entire lives worshiping the Greek gods.
Furthermore, you had wealthy, free Roman citizens treating literal slaves as their spiritual equals. The social and cultural friction must have been absolutely immense.
It was a powder keg. And Paul's letters, books like Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians, are brilliant, agonizing, real-time crisis management. He is constantly writing to these specific cities to extinguish fires.
The believers in Corinth are arguing over whether it is morally permissible to eat meat that was previously sacrificed in a pagan temple. The believers in Galatia are engaged in a vicious debate over whether non-Jewish male converts must physically circumcise themselves to truly join the movement.
Paul uses these letters to mediate the disputes, forcefully arguing that the strict ethnic boundaries of the old Moses covenant have been entirely superseded by the radically inclusive, self-sacrificial love demanded by the new covenant of Jesus.
Alongside Paul's extensive writings, we have the general epistles, letters written by other prominent leaders like James, Peter, and John. These letters tackle a different kind of crisis.
They are primarily addressed to early Christians who are beginning to experience severe, organized persecution from the Roman government. The empire viewed the refusal to worship the emperor as treasonous.
These letters serve as urgent survival manuals. They instruct the believers on how to suffer with dignity, how to maintain their hope when their community members are being executed, and how to stay stubbornly loyal to the nonviolent teachings of Jesus while living under a hostile, violent regime.
Which brings us to the very last book of the massive library, the grand finale, the Book of Revelation.
And fittingly, it is arguably the most debated, controversial, and wildly misunderstood text in the entire collection.
When most people think of Revelation, they think of a terrifying, surreal nightmare filled with multi-headed dragons, bizarre beasts rising from the ocean, cosmic wars, and rivers of blood. It reads like a dark fantasy novel.
And because the imagery is so opaque, modern readers frequently fall right back into the skeleton key misuse. They treat Revelation as a secret, literal, cryptographic puzzle meant to predict modern geopolitical events, the rise of 21st century dictators, or the exact calendar date of the apocalypse.
But reading it that way ignores the fundamental literary genre the author was utilizing. Revelation is a classic piece of apocalyptic literature.
This was a highly popular, well-understood genre in the ancient Jewish world. Apocalyptic literature deliberately utilized wild, extreme, dreamlike symbolism and intense numeric codes to communicate profound theological truths about the present reality. It was essentially political and spiritual resistance literature.
It was written by an early Christian leader named John, who was suffering in exile on a prison island, to encourage a network of churches that were being utterly crushed by the terrifying, seemingly invincible power of the Roman Empire.
Exactly. When the original first-century audience read about a grotesque, multi-headed beast demanding global worship and slaughtering the innocent, they didn't think about a computer chip in the 21st century.
They immediately recognized it as a vivid, subversive caricature of the Roman emperor and the brutal machinery of the empire that was currently hunting them down. The ultimate message of Revelation wasn't designed to be a terrifying puzzle to induce anxiety in modern readers. It was crafted as a powerful, profoundly comforting assurance to those ancient, persecuted believers.
It was a promise that despite the overwhelming, terrifying power of the empires of the world, their God was ultimately sovereign. It promised that evil, violence, and oppression would eventually face ultimate defeat, and that the beautiful, elusive kingdom of eternal peace and justice, the kingdom promised to King David centuries ago, would eventually become a permanent reality, merging the divine realm with a restored earth.
And with that final cosmic vision of a restored universe, the grand, sprawling narrative of the library finally concludes.
Wow. Let's just take a breath and appreciate the sheer magnitude of the historical and literary territory we have just traversed.
It's a lot to take in.
We began in the dusty oral traditions of ancient nomadic tribes in the Middle East. We tracked the rise of an agrarian monarchy, the profound architectural and psychological impact of the temple, the agonizing trauma of the Babylonian exile, and the meticulous human effort to curate a history out of the ashes.
We explored how ancient agricultural debts shaped early laws and how the visceral, bloody covenants bound the narrative together.
We watched the centuries-long anticipation for a king collide with the radical, subversive life of a carpenter from Nazareth. And we tracked the chaotic, explosive spread of a global movement, chronicled through frantic letters written on the dangerous roads of the Roman Empire.
We have identified the massive library, exposed the disastrous modern misuses, locked in the four corner pieces of the covenants, and sorted the hundreds of thousands of edge pieces spanning the Old and New Testaments.
I believe we have thoroughly and successfully delivered on our promise to extract the vital framework of this text. And that concludes our deep dive into Bible Basics, the absolute beginner's guide.
It is a remarkable, relentlessly fascinating collection of documents. And as we close our discussion, if we reflect on the sweeping historical journey we just mapped out, it raises a deeply profound question about how our modern culture interacts with this text today.
How so?
For thousands of years, these specific scrolls and letters were exclusively consumed in a communal setting. They were loudly chanted in ancient temples, debated openly in bustling local synagogues, and those urgent, frantic startup letters from Paul were read aloud to crowded, diverse groups of believers crammed into small, first-century living rooms. The text was an inherently shared, auditory, and communal experience.
But today, thanks to the invention of the printing press and the rise of digital screens, our interaction with the text is almost entirely opposite. We read it silently. We read it completely alone, isolated in our bedrooms, or scrolling through an app on a crowded subway train.
Exactly. The medium has fundamentally changed the experience. So I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. How much of our modern anxiety, our fierce theological confusion, and our drastic misinterpretation of this ancient library stems simply from the fact that a collection of texts explicitly designed to forge, challenge, and guide a living community is now almost exclusively being consumed in total silent isolation?